The German invasion of Norway was the first major Second World War campaign in Western Europe. Launched on April 9, 1940, it marked the end of the so-called Phony War and the beginning of a successful year of military campaigns for Germany. In this series, we'll be looking at the Norway campaign from its causes to its conclusion in June 1940 after a calamitous Allied defeat. We begin with its causes and the Altmark incident in February 1940, which triggered the German decision to invade. From the very beginning of the war in September 1939, both the British and Germans saw Norway as an area of strategic interest. Each year, approximately 3 million tonnes of critically important Swedish iron ore was shipped to Germany through the Norwegian port of Narvik, which made action against Norway desirable for the British. If the iron ore supply could be severed, argued Winston Churchill, the effect would be equivalent to a first-class victory in the field. The Germans meanwhile were pushed to take action by the head of the Kriegsmarine, Erik Raeder, who wanted access to Norwegian ports to base the U-boat fleet, as this would give much greater access to British merchant shipping in the Atlantic. The German High Command was also not slow to recognise the potential threat to its iron supplies, and by the start of 1940 had become so worried about the threat of an Allied occupation of Norway that it had begun to plan its own preemptive invasion to beat them to the punch. They were right to be worried. With the invasion of Finland by the Soviet Union in November 1939, the Allies were handed the ideal pretext to intervene in Scandinavia. By early 1940, a plan was taking shape which would see Allied troops land at Narvik and march across Scandinavia to reach and support the Finns. This plan would, by coincidence, see Allied troops occupy both Narvik and areas of Swedish iron ore production to maintain a line of communication to their troops in Finland. This would undoubtedly cut the Germans off from much of the Swedish iron ore that it needed desperately. And so, at the start of February 1940, both sides were working towards intervention in Norway, but cautiously. The Allies were reluctant to deploy troops to Scandinavia without the permission of the Norwegians and Swedes, and the Germans had not yet committed to an invasion in the short term. Both sides watched their opponents incredibly closely, looking for any signs that a move against Norway was imminent. And then, on February 14, 1940, the German naval auxiliary ship Altmark entered the territorial waters of Norway. On the final leg of a mammoth journey from the South Atlantic, she carried 300 British POWs captured by the pocket battleship the Graf Spee the previous autumn. After the Graf Spee's destruction in Montevideo Harbour in December 1939, Altmark had fled north, managing to evade the British and French navies and make it to the relative safety of neutral waters. After a cursory inspection by a Norwegian vessel from Trondheim on the morning of the 14th, the Altmark was allowed to steam south. However, she was not yet home free. As Altmark approached the port of Bergen, she neared a restricted area of water that Norway did not allow foreign warships to move through. Knowing that sailing around would bring her closer to any British ships in the area, the Altmark's captain, Henrik Lunde, opted to bring his ship inside this restricted zone regardless. The Norwegian response to this was swift. Rear Admiral Tank Nilsen, in command at Bergen, ordered Altmark stopped for another, more comprehensive inspection. This time, the Norwegian officer that boarded the German vessel asked Captain Lunde if he had any prisoners on board. Lunde replied that he hadn't, and Nilsen's officer then informed him that unless he agreed to a search of every compartment in the ship to make sure, the Altmark would have to sail around the restricted zone. Lunde refused. As the officers talked, the British prisoners down below broke into a virtual riot to make their presence known to the Norwegians. Despite German attempts to conceal the noise, they were successful. When the inspection officer returned to his ship, he made a full report, which Nilsen passed on to the government in Oslo. The vessel has refused additional visitation, and passage through the defended area is therefore denied. Prisoners of war are likely to be on board. At this news, the Norwegian government panicked. Wanting to avoid an international incident at all costs, Oslo decided to give Altmark special dispensation to travel through the restricted area, speeding up its journey home. the order issued by Rear Admiral Nielsen was countermanded. Unfortunately for the Norwegians and the Germans, word of Altmark's presence near Bergen got back to the British Embassy in Oslo, which flashed a message to the Admiralty in London. Within hours, a Royal Navy task force consisting of the light cruiser HMS Arethusa and 5 destroyers left Rosyth to intercept the Altmark. The British ships, led from the destroyer HMS Cossack by Captain Philip Vian, moved to the mouth of the Baltic Sea and then swept northwards, hoping to block Altmark's direct route home. Vian's squadron was aided by RAF reconnaissance planes, and in the early afternoon of February 16th the German ship was sighted, hugging the coast south of Egersund. Within 2 hours, Arethusa and the destroyers Intrepid and Ivanhoe caught up with Captain Dow. As the British ships approached, they found 2 Norwegian patrol vessels, Skarv and Kjell, escorting Altmark. The Norwegian ships did not take kindly to Intrepid's attempts to put herself between Altmark and the coast. Protests from Skarv were met with a curt reply from the British destroyer, "I have my orders." As the strange flotilla continued southwards, jockeying for position, Altmark began to run out of room. Up ahead, a group of small islands opposite the entrance to Jøssingfjord would soon leave the German ship with virtually no room to manoeuvre if she continued on her present course, but to steer around them to the south would be to hand the ship to the British. Concluding that his only hope was that the Norwegians would prevent the British from boarding, Captain Dow ordered the Altmark to turn hard to port and into the entrance of the fjord itself. Jøssingfjord was covered with a thin layer of ice that got thicker the further into the fjord the Altmark got. Eventually, Dow's ship ploughed into a thick layer of ice and came to a stop. The Altmark was now trapped. Just after dark, HMS Cossack and the other 2 British destroyers arrived at Jøssingfjord. Captain Vian wasted no time, entering the fjord to speak to the senior Norwegian officer at the scene on board Kjell. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Vian demanded that the prisoners on board Altmark be released. The Norwegian officer, a Lieutenant Halvorsen, replied that he was not aware of any British prisoners being present on Altmark and informed Vian that he had orders to resist a British attempt to board Altmark with force. With this in mind, the British officer retreated from the fjord and contacted the Admiralty, asking for confirmation of his orders to liberate the prisoners. The response, directly from Winston Churchill, was unequivocal. You should board Altmark, liberate the prisoners and take possession of the ship. With a clear green light, Cossack re-entered Jøssingfjord just after 10 PM and approached the Altmark. Realising that the British now meant to board his ship, Captain Dow had one last trick up his sleeve. Ordering Altmark's engines to full astern, he moved to ram the smaller British destroyer, hoping to damage it sufficiently to prevent a boarding. Were it not for some quick thinking from the British destroyer's helmsman, he may well have succeeded. As it was, only a glancing blow was achieved, and the British were able to get alongside and send a boarding party across, led by Lieutenant Commander Bradwell Turner. After a short firefight with the sparsely armed German crew, the British were able to gain control of the ship. Reaching the cargo hold, Lieutenant Commander Turner opened the hatch and, greeted by cheers from the prisoners, shouted, "Come on up, the Navy's here." The diplomatic fallout from the Altmark incident was immense and immediate. Norway protested vigorously at the blatant breach of its neutrality by Britain, while the British argued that Norway had failed to protect her own neutrality in allowing it to be abused by the Germans. In truth, it's a matter of opinion, and you can make a valid case both in support or opposition to the British actions at Jøssingfjord. One thing that is beyond doubt, however, is that the Germans sped up their plans for invading Norway and Denmark as a result. Convinced that when push came to shove the Norwegians would always side with the British, Hitler resolved to occupy the country before the British and French could do the same. This invasion, codenamed Operation Weserübung, would become the first major campaign of the Second World War in the West, and it will be the subject of our next video. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it made, consider joining the ranks of our Patreon supporters, whose support makes it possible for Historigraph to exist. The channel has recently had some trouble with YouTube taking a video down, so support on Patreon is more vital than ever. This has been Historigraph talking about the Altmark incident, and we'll see you next time.